Yes. The question was, can we regulate large companies like Monsanto, and in terms of the impact that they're having on small farms? And yeah, I mean, there's been a real political failure here, and unfortunately, the farm lobby, if you will, isn't really reflecting farm interests as a whole. It's reflecting fairly narrow, very, very well organized, giant agribusiness interests. And there's often a tremendous tension between the interests of farmers as a whole and those of these giant agribusiness corporations. But what Congress tends to react to is the agribusiness interests. And, Congresswoman Louise Slaughter, who's the only microbiologist in the House of Representatives, has for years been pushing legislation called PAMTA, which would limit the use of antibiotics of non-therapeutic use of antibiotics in livestock production. And it amazes me that PAMTA just can't get anywhere in Congress, even though the public health of the country, I think, would benefit tremendously if it were to do so. But because you have these, fairly narrowly contained agribusiness interests that depend very heavily on antibiotic production and use, and they derail everything else. When I always think that we had sheep, as I said, on our farm, and there essentially aren't real sheep subsidies. There is a mild wool subsidy, but not much. And so the number of sheep in this country has plummeted. I think it peaked in about 1947. And this was tough on sheep farmers in America. There were a lot of people who had to sell their sheep operations. They lost money for years. They ended up going into cattle or other areas. But the market, in effect, worked. If we had had sheep subsidies, if we had lamb subsidies, then we would still have as many sheep as we'd had in 1947, and we'd be spending $3 billion a year supporting these wool mountains and lamb mountains, and that, in effect, is what we're doing with corn subsidies, for example.